how does a family of 12 handle the diagnosis of 6 of its children with schizophrenia? Robert Kolker will be here to talk about his new book, Hidden Valley Road. What does Lily King have to say about writers and lovers? My colleague Elisabeth Egan will be here to talk about her latest pick for group text. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's April 10th. I'm Pamela Paul. Robert Kolker joins us now from Brooklyn to talk about his new book, Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. Bob, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
You were last here for your previous book, Lost Girls. And I want to talk about that a little bit later, but let's dive right into the subject of this book because it is truly fascinating. Tell us about the Galvin family. Let's start with the parents, Don and Mimi. They are the subject of this book.
Don and Mimi really lived through the greatest moments of the 20th century. He was a World War II veteran, and the two of them put down roots in Colorado after the war and raised a family and had 12 children. The 12 children spanned the baby boom. The first was born in 1945 and the last in 1965. And they were known in Colorado Springs, Colorado as sort of a model family. Everybody knew the Galvins with their 12 children, and the oldest was a football star and dated the general's daughter at the Air Force Academy. And all of the boys were jocks and won every hockey game they played. They were sort of legends at the time, but nobody really knew that privately the family was suffering, that in the end, 6 of the 12 children were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And it was at a time in America where there was a lot of shame and stigma around mental illness, even more than there is now, where the parents were often blamed. And so it was a secret for as long as they could keep it a secret. And that just led to more damage. And the youngest children in the family really suffered the most from living in that house full of secrets.
Before we get into their stories, it's interesting that you say everyone knew the Galvins in Colorado Springs. My cousin actually grew up in an Air Force family in Colorado Springs and had never heard of them. And so it might be that she's younger. She's in her 40s now. But I'm curious how you came across this family and their story because you're not from Colorado Springs.
Yeah, their heyday was in the early years of the academy. Right after the academy opened in the mid-50s, that was when the family really started to rise up. So they were best known in the late 50s. I know about them because the youngest 2 children, the only girls, were friends of a friend of mine. And for years, these 2 sisters, Margaret and Lindsay, had been talking with one another about the best way to let the world know about their family. But they realized they couldn't do it alone. There was a lot about their family they didn't even know. I mean, a lot of these brothers were 15 or 20 years older than they were. And then, of course, a lot of the medical records they didn't have access to. And a lot of the stories that their parents told they couldn't necessarily verify on their own. A lot of legends going around. And in fact, some of the worst things that happened to the family had been kept secret from them because they were too young when it happened. And so finally they decided to turn to an independent journalist to cover the family independently, to take the story wherever it would lead. And they were confident in doing this because they felt that there was scientific value, medical value in focusing on this family. And they knew that researchers had been talking to them for decades, and they wanted to know what those researchers had learned as well.
Okay, all families don't get along perfectly, and I imagine a family with 12 children, probably even more so. Were they unanimous in their willingness to collaborate with you, to answer your questions, be interviewed?
Well, aside from being completely gobsmacked by the story and really could not believe all this happened to one family, I was pretty convinced in the beginning that there couldn't be a book about this because of medical privacy laws, that all it would take was one sibling standing up and saying, "What? You want a book about this family? No way." And then suddenly it would get very impossible. So I worked very slowly and really took it very easy. And over several months, I would get on the phone maybe once a week with a different family member saying, "So, your sisters are interested in having a book about your family. How does that make you feel?" And sort of took the temperature of the entire family. And to my amazement, everyone was interested and everyone was ready, including Mimi, the family matriarch who had been so determined to keep everything secret for so long. She was in her 90s and ready to talk about it too.
She died in 2017 after you interviewed her. And I want to talk about that interview a little bit because, as you mentioned earlier, at that time, schizophrenia was often blamed on mothers.
Yes, and so she was thrilled to be talking about it from a genetic perspective. We're in the era of genetics now, so it made her feel good to be able to say, yes, well, now we know that it couldn't have been bad parenting, that it was genetics. And so to that part, she was happy. But she was really part of her survival instinct, and part of what made her so functional for so long was that she could really move past a lot of the unpleasantness in her life. So getting her to talk about unpleasant subjects was not easy. And of course, I didn't want to get a 91 or 92-year-old to do anything. I didn't want to traumatize someone who was clearly in such frail health. So what proceeded was me sitting there at the kitchen table with her, and her two daughters were at the table too. And every time she would try to deflect the conversation, one of her daughters would go, "Oh, mom," and try to kind of cajole her gently back to talk about the unpleasant stuff. And eventually, she was able to really open up about some very difficult things, and I was really grateful that to get that kind of clarity from her.
12 children is difficult enough. I mean, 12 children, 10 of them were boys, even if they did not suffer from mental illness, even during the baby boom. That's a lot of kids. Why did they have 12 children?
I spent a lot of time sort of looking into that question. For Don, the father, he was Catholic and he was looking for a distinguished life, and he wanted to stand out in some way, and it made him feel good to be a paterfamilias, and so it pleased him to have so many children. And then Mimi, who was like a lot of women in her generation, a little frustrated that she couldn't intellectually really achieve her dreams. She really gave up her college education and gave up any sort of independent life to be a mother, and she gave up a life of culture and sophistication moving out to the boonies, which is what Colorado was in the 50s, to her as a sophisticated New Yorker. And so she liked being having a certain amount of notoriety and fame and accomplishment of having such a large family. But more than that, I think she was binging on family in a way because of a lot of the losses she had had in her life. She had lost her father when she was younger in a scandal. He sort of became divorced from the family, and she never really had a relationship with him. She now was in a marriage where the husband was increasingly absent. He was a career military guy who really craved a life of the mind and was not an active parent like a lot of fathers in that time period. And so, really, having so many children gave her a lot of company. And I came to appreciate that aspect of it.
So, six of these kids, six of the boys, were ultimately diagnosed with schizophrenia, which, as I understand it, typically emerges in adolescence or young adulthood. Correct me if I'm wrong, but were there earlier signs? How did they first find out about the first child to be diagnosed? Did they suspect something was wrong?
Well, five of the six of them really followed that pattern. They were all 20, 21, 22 in late adolescence when they had their first really visible psychotic breaks. There was one, Peter, who was earlier. He was 14, but there was real trauma right before that happened. He watched his father suffer a stroke. But they were warning signs for some of them. For Donald, the oldest son, he really was a very troubled teenager despite being outwardly so successful and so popular. And he would do things like smash dishes while washing the dishes out of rage, or be overly, almost gratuitously abusive to his younger brothers when he was left to take care of them. There were certain ways that he sort of demonstrated that he wasn't connecting with the world in a traditional way, and that it's almost like there was a barrier between him and others. And that was very visible even in his teenage years. But it only devolved into psychosis once he was in college. He would do things like run into a bonfire during a pep rally or be cruel to animals. There were difficult moments that suddenly were wake up calls to him that something was really wrong. And he started going to see therapists, and his parents started shopping for a medical opinion that could keep him in college and keep the family away from scandal.
Tell us about the cat.
Well, he went to health services at Colorado State with a bite on his hand, saying that a cat bit him, and he didn't explain, and they didn't seem to ask how a cat would be so troubled that it would bite him. And then a year later, he came back with another cat bite, and they looked at his file and said, "What's really going on here?" and he suddenly became very emotionally upset, according to the notes from his visit there. And he said that he had slowly and painfully tortured and killed this cat and that he didn't know why. And that was really the start of his first interaction with the mental health care system of the 1960s. That was when they sent him to therapy. That was when his parents became worried that the entire family would go down the tubes if it came out that their son was mentally ill. And so they decided to hope that he would just grow out of it and shopped for the right medical opinion to keep him in college.
Did you see these notes? Did the family share with you all of the medical records?
Yes, I did. And that was, of course, as a reporter, a glorious and exciting moment to hit a treasure trove like that. But it was something that no one in the family really knew existed. And it took a lot of work. And I give Lindsay, the youngest of the 12 children, a lot of credit because she really filed a lot of paperwork and worked really hard to help secure those documents. And in those documents were a lot of family secrets that most of the family had no awareness of. And those revelations are toward the end of the book. But that moment with the cat, that was not a family story. That came from those medical records.
These kids, these young men, were treated for schizophrenia, but what was their understanding of schizophrenia at the time?
Well, even now, the definition is a slippery one. Back then, whether you would get diagnosed with a certain mental illness often meant which doctor you went to visit. And of course, the official definition in the DSM is sort of changed with each edition, often tailored around the modes of treatment that are available at the time. So diagnosing was always more of an art than a science. But there are certain hallmarks of schizophrenia. Obviously, there are hallucinations and delusions, and there's what they would call catatonia, which is sort of this barrier between the you and the rest of the world that you might demonstrate. This is all like having nothing to do with the stereotype of schizophrenia, which would be, violent behavior or split personality, which is erroneous, not part of schizophrenia. So so quite often there would be delusions, and in fact, Donald, the oldest child, who is in his 70s now and physically healthy and living in assisted living, he still believes and talks very calmly about how he's descended from an octopus and how he's the father of everyone in the family, and he has various certain beliefs that he really holds fast to even after all this time.
The medication at the time was also quite different than it is now, right? The antipsychotics had terrible side effects. How were they treated? And to what extent were they institutionalized?
The boys were in and out of institutions, mainly the one in Pueblo, the state hospital, because this wasn't a wealthy family. But because Mimi was so determined to take care of the boys herself, she offered her home up whenever they would be discharged. And so there was a real revolving door going on there. There was no member of the Galvin family who was institutionalized forever, like Rosemary Kennedy after her lobotomy. And nobody in the Galvin family had a lobotomy. This was more a little later era. This was the era of thorazine and clozapine, these very, very harsh medical instruments, these pharmaceutical instruments that really even today are basically the flagship drugs that are used for people with active psychosis and schizophrenia. This was the big revelation to me. Any drug that's been developed to treat difficult, really acute mental illness like schizophrenia is really still derived from either thorazine or clozapine. It's like they're Coke and Pepsi and there's nothing else. And other mental illnesses, there's been huge advancements, obviously with depression and with bipolar disorder, the medicines have changed, but there's been really quite simply nothing new since the time of the Galvins, which is stunning to me.
And yet, it feels like the culture and our understanding of schizophrenia has changed a lot. I mean, when I was coming of age, you had I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. That was sort of part of the illicit reading of the teenager in the 80s, along with Go Ask Alice and The Three Faces of Eve and Sybil. Was the depiction of schizophrenia in those books and at that time accurate?
Well, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. The general idea there is that there's a little girl who's trapped, not a little girl, a teenage girl who's trapped in a world that she's created. She's in her own bubble, a schizophrenic world. And that it took a caring, diligent, dedicated therapist, Dr. Freed, who is a stand in for the author's own therapist, who is the legendary Frieda Fromm Reichmann. And Dr. Freed is the one who is brave enough and who works hard enough and cares enough to break through the bubble and to pull this girl out of her world and back into the real world. And this is a little like the miracle worker, right? It's a little like Annie Sullivan being so dedicated that she's able to help the patient. And this
Right. No credit to Helen Keller.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. She was there too, Helen Keller. What you get is this sense among psychoanalysts of a certain generation, like a whole swath of them in America, particularly, that really wanted to be like Dr. Freed, that really wanted to be the hardworking, dedicated, diligent person who could keep the patient from needing those horrible drugs, keep them from needing Thorazine, keep them from needing electroshock therapy or a lobotomy or whatever it is the big bad medical world wanted to give them, and help them fend for themselves. And that this was the model. But then there was the other side of this, which were the geneticists and the psychiatrists, the neurologists who would say, no, no, no. This is all about brain chemistry. It's all about dopamine. We need to drug them the right way. But they never found the right way to drug them. And so they were at an impasse. These days, you're right. It's absolutely changed. There's still a debate, but it's a slightly different debate. It's about how much of a genetic load a person really needs before they're vulnerable to schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. And then what other things in the environment might hasten a person's descent into psychosis. This is how you get books like the one last year about marijuana, or the one a few years earlier about toxoplasmosis in cat litter. People have theories about what might hasten it along, like a bacteria or encephalitis or drugs. And that's the debate now.
So it's not a nature or nurture. It's some kind of epigenetic mix, some kind of, you have a predilection or you have a sort of genetic makeup that needs to perhaps be triggered by some other factors.
Exactly. And that's what makes families like the Galvins so interesting to some researchers, and really what's so valuable moving forward. You have this little petri dish of a shared genetic environment, and different people in that shared genetic environment are reacting differently to it. Even the ones who become mentally ill in slightly different ways. It manifests itself differently. So what if you could analyze that family? Perhaps there would be something in there that we could either scale up and understand about everyone, or at least understand how the disease takes shape genetically in one case so that it can help us understand others. So they continue to be vital.
One of the things that's so interesting to me is that it was the two girls, the two lone girls in this family of 12 children, neither of them diagnosed with schizophrenia, who were so eager to talk to you, right? Because their experience obviously must have been quite difficult as well. People maybe don't focus as much on the other siblings. What was it like for them growing up in this family? And why do you think they were so eager to have their story told?
I tried to find a way of asking them this question as many times as I could, as often as I could, because to me, really, beyond the question of how could all this happen to just one family, the real driving question for me in writing the book was, you could have walked away from this family at the age of 18, moved to LA, gone to law school, become a lawyer, sent them Christmas cards once a year, and be done with it. And yet here you are, still part of the mix, still part of this family, still devoted to them in many ways. How does that work? How does that help us understand what it means to be through such trauma? What does it mean to come out of the other side of an experience like this? And how did you come out the other side? And I do devote a lot of time in part 2 of the book to each of the sisters and the very different ways that they coped and moved on and circled back to the family.
I want to just close by going back to your earlier book for a moment, because that was about traumatic events around women. It was about the Lost Girls, 5 murdered prostitutes on Long Island. And I'm curious, are you drawn to dark stories? Is this coincidental? Is there anything that sort of links these two books together for you as a writer?
I think they're linked in that they're about families in crisis. Lost Girls really is about not just 5 women, but 5 families and how they all react in the worst moments of their lives, but not in a rubbernecking kind of way, more in a how can we relate? How can we commune and understand that suffering is universal? I'm a narrative journalist, and I write about everyday people who never imagined they would get media attention. And so quite often that just seems to intersect with tragic subjects, as opposed to writing about politicians or celebrities. It just sort of happens that way. So it's not like I'm a moth to the flame necessarily.
All right. Speaking of celebrities and things that don't usually happen to normal people, you got a very exciting phone call recently. Tell us about that.
My publisher had been keeping it a secret from me for several days while they were working out the details. But on a Friday a few weeks ago, I got a phone call from Oprah Winfrey. And of course, I did what anybody would do. I would burst out laughing and couldn't believe that it actually was her on the other end of the line. But sure enough, it's her book club selection, and I couldn't be happier about it personally, but also happy for this family that was so brave to come forward and tell their story.
But do tell us, what did she say? What did you say?
Well, at first I didn't pick up the phone. She was calling from a no caller ID. And I got this weird cryptic email from the publicity department at Doubleday saying, "Could you pick up the phone the next time somebody calls?" And I said, "All right." And then I pick up the phone and she says, "This is Oprah Winfrey." I just couldn't believe it. I started laughing. She probably gets that a lot. So she knew what to do and was, kind of very disarming and very kind and very, had a lot of praise for the book. And I immediately told her how much the family would be grateful to know about this. And I'm really still over the moon about it. I'm very, very happy that she selected this book and this story.
Well, let's end with the family's reaction. You call them, you tell them, guess what?
Well, Lindsay was the funniest. She said that when they were younger, they would watch Oprah Winfrey's show and they would turn and say, "These people she has on the show, they're boring compared to us." And that I thought was very telling, and it made me think that perhaps Oprah Winfrey read this book and really understood what it meant, and really could commune with this family in the way that she's communed with so many people over the years.
Well, it's a very happy moment in what is a book that's largely about tragedy. And I'm so glad for you to get this kind of attention. This is a difficult moment for authors. Book tours are canceled. I imagine you're relatively grounded in Brooklyn where you are. Bookstores, many of them are closed. Libraries are closed. So congratulations to the much deserved attention to the book, Bob.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Robert Kolker is the author of Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Elisabeth Egan joins us now to talk about her latest selection for group text, which is Lily King's new book, Writers and Lovers. Liz, thanks for being here.
Pamela, thanks for having me.
So I want to say we're a little late. We had our 3-week hiatus. Normally, we would have talked about this book at the beginning of March, and we are now into April. So we will save your April pick for a couple of weeks from now. But for the moment, for those who missed it, let's talk about Lily King's new book. Tell us a little bit first about Lily King. I know her as the author of Euphoria, which was one of our 10 best books of the year a few years back at the book review.
Lily has written several other novels. I believe the one she's best known for is Euphoria. And that's the only other one of her novels besides Writers and Lovers that I've read. This one is a big departure from Euphoria. And I think, and I may be in the minority on this, I don't know, I love this one even more than I loved Euphoria, which was, I thought, beautiful and wonderful. But Writers and Lovers really just hit me right in the heart in the best way. It's about a woman named Casey Peabody, who's 31 years old. She's living in Boston. She works at a restaurant. Her mother has just died. And she's young enough to think that there is a statute of limitations on grief. She doesn't really know anyone else who has lost a parent at this point in life. And she's trying desperately to get back on her feet against many odds. She's in debt. She has some concerning health issues. And she really wants to get out of the life of waiting tables. She's an aspiring writer. And the book has sort of 3 strands. The strand that is the portrait of the artist as a young woman, or the portrait of a writer as a young woman. The story of her grief after losing her mother. And it's also a love story. The lover part as I said in my review, I think comes second in the title for a reason, because it's not the main thing, but it's one of my favorite parts of the book. She has these two relationships, one with a well-established writer who is a widower and a father of two, and one with a fellow aspiring writer who drives a beat-up car, wears a leather jacket, and knows how to pack a perfect picnic. And we see her toggling between these two men in kind of a touching way.
So I know that for your picks for group text, you look for novels or memoirs that have something in there that's really discussion worthy, something meaty to grapple over or to debate or argue or just nod heads knowingly about. Like, what is it in Writers and Lovers?
In this case, it's, I think, a nod head knowingly kind of book. The central theme here to me, and one I suspect will be the one that book clubs talk about the most, is the idea of coming of age. To me, I've always been fascinated by the idea that you can come of age several times in your life. When we talk about a coming of age novel, people always think of adolescence. And to me, it's always interesting to see a person coming of age at an age when you think they might already be an adult. And I think Casey Peabody is one of those people. It's the idea of when in life are you fully baked? And to me, the most interesting people are never fully baked. And it's
So we can all still be coming of age?
There's still hope for us, Pamela.
Okay, thank you.
So I think that the thing that people will talk about is this idea of the potential of still finding yourself, the potential of still grabbing on to whatever dream it is that you've been holding on to since high school. And also, if for book clubs who are willing to get a little bit weepy, I think this idea of, do you ever really let go of a parent? And I think the answer to that question for most people is probably no.
I want to say something about book clubs before we end, because I'm curious if your book club is still meeting, Liz. My book club is having its first Zoom meeting on Monday. What is yours doing?
My book club had a Zoom meeting the other night, and I have to admit, I chose my Zoom meeting with some college friends over the book club.
You ditched your book club?
I ditched my book club just this month. I'm a very loyal member, but this month I had some important topics to hash out with the college friends, so I did it.
Wow, so you had competing Zoom invites.
You wouldn't expect. I am more popular by Zoom than I am in real life.
I
don't know
say
why.
Here, as an aside, that Liz and I right now have been trying to schedule our own cocktail Zoom, and I'm finding it very hard to get onto Liz's calendar, so I'm not surprised. But we get to meet here on the podcast.
Yes, this is a pleasure.
All right, Liz, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Elisabeth Egan is an editor at The Book Review and the writer of our ongoing monthly column, Group Text. Our intrepid reporter, Alexandra Alter, joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
How are things?
Things are still shaky, of course, like every industry, but there was a glimmer of hope last week. The print sales that came in that were reported by NPD Bookscan actually rose. And I think part of that is due to a sort of earlier Passover and Easter schedule, a lot of gift giving. The print sales went up almost 7% last week over the week before. And
that's amazing.
Yes, it's very strong. And, the strongest gains were, if you looked at the particular titles, there were a lot of Easter books. So this was a gift-giving kind of moment. But you did see gains all over. Adult nonfiction print sales units rose almost 7%. Humor books were up almost 25%. So you can see what people are reaching for right now. And even adult fiction went up by almost 4%. So it looks like people are kind of settling into this situation and reaching for books, which is great. And, there are still ways to get them. As our colleague Concepcion de Leon wrote, there's a number of ways you can still buy books from independent bookstores and get books from the library if you have an e-reader, things like that. So it's great to see this moment, particularly after a pretty significant drop the previous week and the week before that. So this is good. And across the industry, there's still the issue of bookstore closures. Most bookstores are not considered to be essential businesses. So they're really trying to cope, particularly independents, which maybe didn't have a robust internet presence or online sales. So there has been a really concerted effort from authors and from publishers to support independents. And one of the most high-profile ones recently was the author James Patterson, who's, of course, an incredibly successful writer known for his big blockbusters. And so he started this campaign called Save Indie Bookstores. He donated $500,000 of his own and is trying to get other people to contribute as well.
I've heard of a couple of other bright spots that cookbooks, not surprisingly, are doing really well, and children's books that she reported on, lots of people trying to homeschool or some variation on that with workbooks and kind of educational books.
And to sort of combine those two trends, children's cookbooks are very popular right now. It's like if you have your kid at home, well, you might as well put them to work in the kitchen, I guess. But yeah, there are some books on the bestseller list that are cooking with your kids.
Are your kids industriously baking in your kitchen?
They did make a very good pound cake from one of our children's cookbooks. So I do have to say I've benefited from the trend personally. But yeah, in terms of looking at the rest of the spring, we're still seeing a lot of publishers moving titles kind of frantically into the fall in hopes that there will be some return to normalcy and there will be more of a kind of robust retail environment then. One of the most high-profile titles, which I think was a bit of a disappointment to people that were looking forward to it, was the new Elena Ferrante book, The Lying Life of Adults. And so that won't be coming out until September now, and that was due previously to come out in June.
I have to say, as an editor of a book review, this is it's like constantly chasing a child that runs away, you know, running around the block, because we will build an entire issue very excited around a book or a review of the book, and only to find that book disappear into 2021 in many cases. I think probably because, and correct me if I'm wrong, publishers were trying to avoid the fall and the election. And there are certain kinds of books that if they were trying to come up before the election, still are so dependent on media coverage that they have to leapfrog into 2021.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really become a mad scramble. And there was, you know, when publishers were planning out their 2020 releases a year ago, everyone was desperate to avoid the fall because the assumption was people are going to be glued to the political news. And now people are rushing into the fall. And of course, that creates a domino effect. So if you had any book planned for the fall, you have to sort of shift that. And I was actually surprised to see things have been moved multiple times, first to the summer, then to the fall. The fact that publishers are so nervous about the summer is a little bit disheartening, particularly because that's, you know, often a big reading kind of season for people. Summer reading is something that we cover every year and people are looking forward to. So hopefully, you know, there'll still be some really good new releases. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things take shape in the fall.
One other interesting trend that we're just starting to see on the book review side is that any books that were sort of talking about the state of the world, politically, economically, or in any way pontificating on the future, some of those have been bumped to 2021. In other cases, we've seen publishers tacking on new introductions or new endings because otherwise the books will just feel so out of tune, out of sync with the realities that we're living in.
Exactly. I mean, that is one of the dangers of writing anything in the nonfiction field that is addressing, at this point, economics, politics, public health, all those subjects. It's all changing by the minute. So that's certainly a real challenge for people. And I've seen that too. I've been getting emails from publishers saying, here's a new pub date and a new introduction to this title.
A new ending, a new middle.
Yeah, we all want to know
changing
how
the
this
title. The author is a new person.
Yes, exactly.
All right, Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Our critics are back with us. Joining us now, my colleagues Dwight Garner and Jennifer Salai. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's situate ourselves. Jen, where are you?
I am currently in a room off the kitchen in my home, and I'm staring at my laptop and talking into a mic.
Got it. I'm very fascinated now that we're seeing where everyone is in their home, to see the decor, to look at people's bookshelves, especially to see those internal spaces. Dwight, where are you?
I'm in my office in a small house we're renting for a year in Fairmont, West Virginia, where I'm reporting a book. My shelves are still full here. In my office, I keep all the advanced copies of books, the galleys that come in. And as Jen has probably noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed, Pamela, the galleys just are beginning to dry up because publishers aren't sending them out any longer. And I'm going to miss them because I like books. I like books on paper, and now they're going to be coming to us by PDF, I think.
They are. They are. I mean, we're already there with the book review and the rest of the desk because we left our office in dribs and drabs. The last time I was there was on March 16th, mostly to pack up and take in suitcases and tote bags lots of books home to distribute to others. But when I left a week later, I was told there was mail for us, and it was 167 boxes.
Oh my God.
So that's the last delivery I know of. And I think that was around the 20th of March. They were moved into a locked room where they remain. And I feel like they will be joined by others by the time we return, whenever that is.
This is interesting. It makes me recall I was working at the book review in 2001 at 9/11. The book review was in the previous New York Times building, the building on West 43rd Street, Manhattan. The New York Times building they built a new building. And it's in a different location now. But back then, after 9/11, you'll forget the anthrax scare. People were mailing these envelopes around. So for about a month, every envelope and package that came into the New York Times was put through this washing system. Like everything that came in, when you got it, it was as if it'd been like wet and someone had dried it out. All your papers were wrinkled. And for about a month, all the galleys were kind of like wrinkled up because they went through this clean system. And I kind of feel like I'm having this deja vu. I'm kind of suspicious now of every package that comes into to my door.
Well, there is these security measures that are still in place at the time, so that not my book mail. My book mail seems to be unaffected, but my snail mail comes to me, generally speaking, kind of every 6 or 7 days. And there's just an insane quantity of it. And most of it is invitations to things that have already, taken place.
You mean
so
book
it's
parties?
Parties and events and talks and lectures that I have now missed. So it kind of narrows down the possibilities. Anyway, let's talk about some books. Dwight, let's start with you.
Oh, I reviewed this book that was kind of fun to read. It's called Mitch Please. The subtitle is How Mitch McConnell Sold Out Kentucky and America Too.
So he has an opinion.
Yeah, the author is this young founder of a popular sports radio show in Kentucky. He kind of has a progressive blue-collar liberal bent, and he kind of mixes his politics in with his basketball and other sports talk. Although, to interject, I feel for guys now who have sports radio shows. I have not tried to watch ESPN for a while. I'm not a big sports guy, but I have no idea how people are filling their time. But he got to be really popular in Kentucky, and the National Democratic Party and others wanted him to run for office. And he debated running against Mitch McConnell. He decided not to eventually. But this book is this account of this trip he took across all of Kentucky's 120 counties. I write in my piece, why so many counties, Kentucky? That's a lot of counties in a small state. But he goes through all of them and just talks to people and wants to figure out why Mitch McConnell, who polls so badly in Kentucky and is so widely disliked, why he keeps winning elections there.
Why?
Well, it's sort of the devil is among the first reasons. Another reason is gerrymandering. But he calls Mitch McConnell the most destructive force in American democracy. He says he's just, you study his politics, a man furiously intent on making the rich richer. He throws a lot of shade at McConnell. He calls him a human sleep aid. He writes, to call Mitch a people person would be like calling Jared Kushner a self-made man, that kind of thing. And so he throws a lot of mud, but at the same time, he goes around and talks to all sorts of people around the state and tries to put people and facts to his opinions.
Are there other interesting forms of bad politics in this book that we should know about?
Well, I mean, he talks a lot about coal because, in Appalachia, coal is a big issue, and in Kentucky in particular. And he just thinks that, when the history of coal is written, Mitch McConnell will be one of the chief villains. He has some news in this book. I mean, the Democratic Party should pay attention to this book, I think, in a couple regards. I mean, he worries about the Democratic Party losing its working class roots. And he writes, name me one Democratic national political figure or media member who currently represents rural America. Can you think of one who lives in a small town? Can you think of a notable Democrat with a Southern accent? That's something worth thinking about, I think.
When we think about Mitch McConnell, and we're not in Kentucky, we think about him obviously in Washington, but I'm curious, what his life is like in his political life and his family life in Kentucky. Is he sort of out and about with his wife, Elaine Chao? Do they have children? Are they people who are known to go to the county fair?
Well, that's one of the main themes of this book, is that most of the people have never seen Mitch. If you believe this book, Mitch doesn't visit anyone anywhere at any time. I mean, it sounds like he's sort of holed up. The author goes around and talks to hundreds of people, and none of them have ever seen Mitch McConnell. There's no real sense of his home life either. I kept waiting. It's one thing I sort of look for, we all look for in our politicians. We want a sense of how they live, what they read, what do they do for fun, what do they eat? You want to get a sense of a rounded human being. And there's zero sense of that with Mitch McConnell.
What's the book like to read, just as a reading experience? 120 county tour. Is that fun?
Well, you've hit on something there, because Jones has a terrific prose style, at least a lot of the time, and along with his co-writer, Chris Tomlin. But they have this conceit in which they're going to take us through all of Kentucky's 120 counties. And after a while, this road trip really drags. The trivia in this book really piles up. He visits a cat-themed used bookstore and the world's only life-size replica of Noah's Ark and, Dinosaur World. And after a while, the tour really drags this book down. And the book is about 500 pages, and it probably would have been a pretty great book at about 200 pages.
So it didn't leave you wanting to head over state lines to Kentucky?
Nay.
Jen, what did you read?
So a book that I reviewed recently that I wanted to draw attention to is called Unworthy Republic. And the subtitle is The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. And it's by a historian at the University of Georgia named Claudio Sant. And it's one of these books that's, on the one hand, it's a serious history. It really, he really goes through the documents in order to trace this history of the expulsion of 80,000 Native Americans over the course of the 1830s from their homes in the eastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi. But it's also, I think, incredibly readable. And so I think that combination is something that I only come across occasionally in some of the books that I read. And I think it's a really difficult thing to do. I mean, there are plenty of books that have really important information that present them clearly even, but this book does something else. And what he does is he really sort of narrates this history. This is really a narrative history. He finds the people that exemplify some of the things that he's talking about. And, one of the things that he points out is that this policy that was signed into law in 1830 by President Andrew Jackson was actually presented as a humanitarian enterprise, which, when we think about it now, I mean, it's often referred to as the Trail of Tears. And, he says that one of the things was because it was presented in high-flown terms, it was also talked about as a chance for this new growing federal bureaucracy to show how it could carry out policy very systematically, rationally, within a strict budgetary constraints. And then when he actually shows how it was carried out, it was anything but. I mean, it was completely chaotic. It was rife with fraud. So many people not only suffered, but also died on the way to the west of the Mississippi. And so he looks at the discrepancy between those things. And he also shows that despite all the high-flown rhetoric, that the people who were really clamoring the most for this policy were Southern plantation owners in the United States, because they were really attracted to the land where a number of these Native Americans lived, because it was very fertile agricultural land. And so they saw an opportunity, especially when Andrew Jackson became president, to use basically the apparatus of the federal government to allow them to accomplish this.
How tightly focused is it? Is this a good introduction to the subject?
It's interesting because he's very good at pulling up very specific detail, but he also situates it within a frame, and he talks about these larger themes, and he talks about this, this entwined history between slavery and the forced relocation of Native Americans, which I think is maybe something that some people have thought about, but haven't necessarily thought about in any detailed way. And he does go into that. So I was really impressed by it.
I ask about how good an introduction to the subject it is because I wonder if someone, for example, enjoyed David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon and left that book feeling like, okay, now I know about this very specific incident in Oklahoma, but I want to get a sense of the greater history. This would be a good book to start.
Yes, I think it is a good book to start with. I will say that Sant is focused mainly on the Native Americans in the southeast of the U.S. I mean, he does talk a little bit about the ones who lived in the more northern parts of the country, but he really is focused on the experience of those in the southeast. You know, he does make a case about why it's important to focus on that experience. And he also, I think, offers some complications in his narrative, which I think are also really useful for people to think about, you know, in terms of, for example, northern financiers who profited from expulsion policies, and as well as, you know, Native Americans who themselves owned slaves, which is another interesting aspect of this history. So I would recommend it to people who want an introduction to this subject.
That is fascinating. Native Americans owned African American slaves?
Yeah, he doesn't go into great detail, but he does talk a little bit about this. And, you know, it's the whole sort of landscape that he depicts is just something that I think is incredibly, I think, vivid. And I think for people who want to understand what happened, it's helpful to have somebody who really knows how to narrate this story.
Jen, this is our first time talking since we have all entered into quarantine. Dwight and I had a whole conversation about this on last week's episode. How are you doing, and how has your reading life been affected, or has it not been?
I would say, you know, it's interesting because I think about it more in the context of the people that I live with, which is, you know, my husband as well as my daughter. And in terms of my day-to-day life, just because of what my job was before, it hasn't changed a ton. I will say that in terms of just trying to focus and get my concentration right, that's been a challenge just because I think, you know, probably like everybody, it's hard not to just feel like I constantly have to know what's going on with this pandemic. I mean, because it affects everyone. But in terms of my reading life, you know, it's funny because I just finished a book that I had been long meaning to read, but I hadn't gotten around to until very recently, which is Ling Ma's Severance. Have either of you read that?
Oh, I love that book. I love that book.
It talks about this future or not future. It's actually, I think, set in the past, but it talks about this virus that takes over the world, the Shen virus. And so there is something really eerie about reading about this situation that really very much mirrors our own.
Can we hijack the conversation and talk a little bit more about Severance?
Sure.
Because I felt like what that book did so brilliantly, in my opinion, was, I mean, on the surface, of course, it was this great kind of end of the world, post-apocalyptic, very fast-paced book. I mean, I remember I was reading it in Iceland and was very happy to have jet lag so that I kind of could be up all night, you know, reading. Unlike pure fun genre, it really explored issues of race and immigration and gender and violence. I just thought it was so smart.
It's so smart, and she's such a skillful, talented writer. And also, you know, it was interesting because the protagonist of the book, you know, she is very isolated, and not just because of what has actually happened, but also just because of her own upbringing. And just so that's also something very interesting in the book, where she just really sort of evokes the sense of being alone and what that feels like, which I think a lot of people are grappling with right now.
Two other things that I liked about that book. One, it was kind of a rare millennial novel that I really enjoyed.
Is she a millennial? I guess she is.
She is. She is. I mean, it felt like, and it was also about the workplace. And one of the things I also found so original and kind of fun about the book was that the symptoms of the illness that would happen to people when they became infected with this virus is, and I read this now over a year ago, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like they went through these kind of convulsive reenactments of their former lives where they would just kind of get caught in like a loop of behaviors, whether it was like trying on clothing or putting on makeup or, getting ready to go to the office. And it felt like a really interesting statement on what I think a lot of millennials find to be a meaningless, repetitious nature of contemporary office work and consumer culture.
Yes, and I think that's exactly right, because the protagonist, I mean, she has this job working for this, I guess it's a publisher of Bibles. And so she, before the disease hits, is constantly traveling to China, and she's looking at specs and how these books are actually crafted and how they're actually manufactured. So there's also talk about like manufacturing chains, as well as the boredom of actual office life and all the emails. And I mean, it captures a lot, and it's not a particularly long book. So it's really powerful. It just sort of hits you, I think, when you read it. And I felt when I was reading it in the midst of all of this, I was like, this is either the best idea or the worst idea to read this now. I wasn't sure, but I'm glad I did.
Well, as long as we're on that topic, and before we go, I want to recommend what I think is a really fun quarantine book and very funny. I don't know if either of you have read it. It's Betty McDonald's memoir, The Plague and I. Have either of you read this book?
No.
Have you heard of it?
Never heard of it.
No, neither have I.
Oh. Okay, here you go. And to all of our listeners, please find this book if you can and read it if you are in the mood to laugh over horror. So this is Betty McDonald, who is known for many readers today as the author of the children's books, the Mrs. Pigglewiggle series. But she is so much more. She wrote a number of memoirs, and the most famous of them is probably The Egg and I, which was turned into movies. There are two real-life characters in it, Ma and Pa Kettle, who became these sort of spin-offs. I think they had a whole TV series with Ma and Pa Kettle. That book was about Betty McDonald moving with her husband to rural Washington state to start up a chicken farm. Thus the title. And she really hates chickens, and she hates living in this rural area. Ma and Pa Kettle are kind of their bumpkin neighbors. And that book is hilarious and has nothing whatsoever to do with our current moment. But the book that does is The Plague and I, which was recently reissued by the University of Washington Press. And that was a book about when Betty had tuberculosis and was put into a sanatorium in which they were essentially confined to their beds the whole time with all kinds of insane medical and behavioral treatments. Like they weren't allowed to read books, which, to me was just like a completely unnatural and unnecessarily cruel punishment. And they had to take these sort of, hot steaming baths, and they had it's kind of unclear. You didn't really want to visualize it, but it was something akin to their lungs being punctured in order to like release the toxic. It's the kind of thing that you read and you're like, this really cannot have any grounding in medical science. But what she does while there is just write hilariously about her and her fellow inmates. And if I could go on one more second, there's a character in it who's sort of the quiet star of the book, this woman, Kimi, who then went on, she was a Japanese American, to write her own book possibly about internment during World War II. I haven't had a chance to track that down, but I highly recommend, if you're in the mood to laugh over quarantine, Betty McDonald's The Plague and I. All right, let's run down the books that you reviewed. Dwight.
Yeah, I reviewed Mitch Please, How Mitch McConnell Sold Out Kentucky and America Too by Matt Jones with Chris Tomlin.
And Jen?
I reviewed Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory by Claudio Sant.
Excellent. And just in case people want to take notes, the other book Jen recommended was Ling Ma's Severance, and I blathered on about Betty McDonald's The Plague and I. Thank you both so much for being here. Being here in quotes, as everything is. All right, take care.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.